Welcome to Session 7 of the 10th Bach Network Dialogue Meeting and Edition 5 of Discussing Bach. I'm Larry Molinaro with Live Arts Maryland in the United States, and I'm also a member of the Bach Network. And it's my pleasure to be introducing this session on Bach cantata texts, poetic techniques, and meanings. And for those of you watching online, this is a recording of the discussion taking place live here at Mattingly Hall in lovely Cambridge on a very hot July day. But I can say that the temperature is hot, but the conversation and the ideas have been hotter. During this session, we will start with a presentation by Michael Marissen on the relationship of text and dance types in cantatas 68 and 208, and this will be followed by a presentation by Ruth Tatlow on poetic techniques and meanings within cantata texts. And following those two presentations, Michael Maul will offer a response. And then finally, we will have time to open up for questions from all of you. First, a few words about our presenters, not for the benefit of those of you in the room, because we are family, but mostly for the benefit of those of you online. Ruth Tatlow is chair of the Bach Network and of the program committee for this dialogue meeting. She is a visiting research fellow at Uppsala and Cambridge universities. She is known for her work on numbers, alphabets, and compositional techniques in Bach's time, and also for her commercial program notes for John Eliot Gardner's Bach Cantata Pilgrimage. Michael Marissen is professor emeritus of music at Swarthmore College. His publications include Tainted Glory and Handel's Messiah, Bach and God, and multiple essays in Harvard Theological Review and the New York Times. His new book, Bach Against Modernity, will be published in 2023 by Oxford University Press. He is currently preparing, with co-author Daniel Malamed, historically informed parallel German-English texts of the librettos from Bach's cantatas, with annotations freely available at bachcantatatexts.org. And Michael Maul is the artistic director of the annual Leipzig Bach Festival and is renowned for his research work through the Bach Archive, especially the discovery of previously unknown manuscripts by Bach and others, and on the students of the St. Thomas School. And so with that brief introduction, I will turn this over to Michael Marissen.
Great, thanks. If you squint your ears while listening to the opening movement from Bach's cantata Also hat Gott die Welt geliebt, BWV 68, you could be forgiven for thinking that this somewhat dirge-like music might be from a passion setting. The subject of the present brief talk is the remarkable immediate reaction to this chorus that Bach provided in his musical setting of the following aria poetry by Marianne von Ziegler. My believing that is in Christ's heart, exalt, sing, make merry, your Jesus is there, that is in you my heart. Away lament, away torments, to you, that is to you torments and lament. I wish only to say, my Jesus is at hand. The semantic content of Ziegler's poem is strikingly upbeat, and the mood of Bach's musical setting certainly reflects that. It's hard to imagine that this aria's Frohlockung could be any more forcefully contrasted with the Jammer of the opening chorus than the way it is in the following performance by the magnificent Austrian boy soprano, Peter Jelositz, with the Concertus Musicus Wien under the direction of Nicholas Harnoncourt. In comparison to the extremely moving and dignified, even if naively joyful, manner in which Jelositz counters the lamenting character of Bach's opening chorus, it's hard to imagine a more perverse interpretation of this aria than what I would call the bordello soprano approach in the following performance by the magnificent Dutch singer Johannes Zomer with the orchestra der J.S. Bach Stiftung under the direction of Rudolf Lutz. Let me be quick to say that, in my opinion, this group normally delivers performances of staggering interpretive and other excellence, but as the saying goes, even Homer nods sometimes. Nods off, that is. Okay. From a closer endeavor to attend to how Baroque musical references work and to what Baroque religious language plausibly signifies, it will seem that Jelozit's naively joyful yet dignified interpretation is a fitting one, and that Zomer's vampish interpretation, though powerful and interesting, is a rather misguided one. One must, of course, beware of the genetic fallacy, but what is less often understood or acknowledged in our field is the need to watch out for what might be called the fallacy of reception, the notion that an interpretation has to be considered warranted simply by dint of the fact that it is felt to work so well for one's purposes. This brings me more specifically to the subject of the title of our session this afternoon, Bach Cantata Text, Poetic Techniques and Meanings. There's nothing surprising in seeing that, faced with Ziegler's cheerful text, Bach composed an extremely cheerful musical setting. On closer inspection, what may be surprising, though, is how Bach dealt with Ziegler's poetic techniques and how this in turn might affect contextually or otherwise plausible meanings of Bach's aria. The first technical thing to notice is that Ziegler's poem features accents on every third syllable. Mein gläubiges Herze vor Locker sing Scherze, dein Jesus ist da, wer jammer, wer klagen, ich will euch nur sagen, mein Jesus ist nah. One might reasonably expect a triple meter musical setting then, but Bach's setting is in duple meter, and in the shaping process, it now and then catches some rather striking tonic accents on weak syllables. The vocal melody is notably marked by duple grouping and duple subdivision of the beat, by 4-beat plus 4-beat phrasing with repose on beat 7, not beat 8, and by a pickup note preceding the first metrically strong beat. These are precisely the distinguishing features of the French court dance called the bourrée. French court dances were heavily cultivated in Bach's Leipzig, and his audiences will not simply have intellectually recognized the allusions to these steps in his cantata arias and choruses, but will surely, as the recent work of John Butt, and especially of Bettina Farvig, has so compellingly argued, also have acutely felt them in their bodies. Although there is no reason to think that anyone got up and started performing the actual dance steps in church, there's every reason to think that people discreetly tapped their toes to the corresponding beats, just the way that many do among today's concert and CD or streaming audiences. The bourrée was the musically least complex of the court dances, and it was continually described as gentle, pleasant, unprofound, but nobly joyful. The other end of the spectrum was the sarabande. Bach's partly Procrustean fitting of Ziegler's dactylic poetry into the rhythmic and phrasing constraints of the noble bourrée, then, was presumably designed more to underscore and subtly enhance the mood than to reflect the form of Ziegler's poetry. The 4-bar bass line that precedes the entry of the vocal bourrée, before going on immediately to serve as its counterpoint, had been employed by Bach in the aria Weil die Wollen reichen Herden durch dies weit gepriesene Feld, from a great title for an aria, from his secular cantata Was mir behagt ist nur die muntere Jagd, BWV 208. There, it precedes the entry of an entirely different vocal line before going on immediately to serve as its counterpoint. That vocal line and its counterpoint are marked by duple grouping and by duple subdivision of the beat, by 4-beat plus 4-beat phrasing with a repose on beat 8 now, not beat 7, and by the lack of a pickup note preceding the first metrically strong beat. These are the distinguishing features of the French court dance called the gavotte, whose tempos are also slower than those of bourrées. The gavotte was the second least complex of the French court dances, and when drawn upon in settings of vocal music, its ideals of calm balance were often correlated with pastoral references, as they indeed are, for example, in Cantata 208. In reworking this music from Cantata 208 for Cantata 68, Bach decided to set a new bourrée vocal line above the earlier gavotte instrumental counterpoint. Ingeniously, he was able to retain all the distinguishing features, technical features of both dances by having the steps of the bourrée go by at double the speed of the gavotte. Only in this way, for example, could he retain landing characteristically at a repose on step 7 of the vocal line's bourrée structure, while at the same time that the instrumental line lands characteristically at a repose on step 8 of its gavotte structure. Here's how the gavotte steps of the iambic text from Cantata 208 mesh with the bourrée steps of the dactylic text from Cantata 68. And you can read that at your leisure. And here's how their musical settings mesh. The gavotte steps are given in red and the bourrée steps in blue. This is really amazing. Finding a reasonable tempo for performing the Cantata 68 aria will essentially be governed by the constraints of convincingly performing the vocal line. Its listeners, who are wont to tap their feet, will now inevitably do so to the quarter note level in Bach's notation of the aria, which here would correspond exactly to a rate at which bourrée dance steps move along at a characteristic pace. Bourrées and gavottes are ordinarily notated with their dance steps at the half note. Some listeners to the Cantata 68 aria may tap to its notated half notes, but it is worth noting that the rate at which these longer beats would go by will, on account of the overall tempos having been essentially set by the bourrée lines, be too slow to correspond to a rate at which actual gavotte steps go by at a characteristic pace. I know that's a lot to say. That is to say, while the architecture of the Cantata 68 aria involves bourrée and gavotte structures whose particular cultural associations doubly underscore and enhance textual meaning in number, there are 2 dance structures, not just one, and in proportion, the phrasing of the second dance goes by at half the speed of the first. The aria's bourrée-ness will be readily felt in the body of the listener, while its gavotte-ness will be unreadily perceived only in the mind, if at all. As such, Bach's musical setting provides an extraordinary interpretive superfluity, hard to say, it's an English word. Yes, like its verbal text, it projects a naively joyful response to the opening chorus, but unlike its verbal text, Bach's setting at the same time houses finely nuanced gradations of nobility. His aria's astonishing counterpoint of 2 aristocratic dance types aligns, 1, with the thematically and timbrally distinct counterpoint in scoring of cello and soprano, 2, with the phrase-metrically distinct counterpoint in dance types of felt quick step and intellectually discerned slow step, and thus 3, with the experientially distinct metaphorical counterpoint of perception by body and mind. Such richness of untroubled joy puts me in mind of the famous Scots and doubtless Calvinist story about the visitor from England who meets an elderly female resident as she takes a walk on a beautiful summer's evening by the banks of Loch Lomond. "Good evening. Gorgeous weather," he greets her. "Aye, aye," she says, shaking her head, "we'll pay for this." And indeed, Cantata 68 moves on in its bass recitative and aria to a spate of cryptic language about sin and guilt before closing with a stern choral fugue about eternal damnation. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, for a fascinating presentation. And I know that we'll have time for questions after Michael's response. And right now we welcome Ruth.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Michael. Bach cantata texts, poetic techniques and meanings. Same title, totally different answer. So, I wanted to start my presentation with this lovely emblem that I recently discovered because its mottos give us an insight into how music was understood in Bach's time. In praise of music. The tongue-twisting Latin motto reads, innumeros, numerus, numeros, numerabilis edit, etc. An innumerable number produces innumerable numbers, just as a song brings forth variations in wondrous modes or wondrous ways. Now, you might be wondering what on earth all these number words have to do with Bach cantata texts. Part of the answer lies in the Lutheran understanding of creation. Lutherans in Bach's time believed that God put order into all created things. They believed that God created the universe numerically, from the tiniest molecule to the most massive distances between planets. And God didn't just use any old numbers when he created the universe. He used the numbers of music. These numbers were first demonstrated as ratios by Pythagoras and were made visible and audible on a monochord, still used in Bach's time as a teaching instrument. The monochord has a length of string tightened between two fixed points and a movable bridge. When the bridge is placed exactly in the middle of the string length and plucked on either side of it, the pitch is identical, which demonstrates that 1-to-1 is a unison. When the bridge divides the string into three parts, it sounds an octave, demonstrating visually and orally that 1-to-2 is an octave, and so on. God's numerical ordering of the universe became known as universal harmony. Universal harmony was an ancient belief, and it was still fundamental to the Lutheran worldview of Bach and his contemporaries in the 18th century. In 1691, musician and theorist Andreas Werkmeister explained this: music is a mirror of divine creatures and of the wisdom of God, yes, of God's creatures and of his image itself in a certain measure, because music consists of the same form and proportion as man. And you will probably have seen this image of Vitruvian Man by Da Vinci, which demonstrates the perfect harmonic proportioning of the human body. They saw universal harmony as factual, their science, if you like. These precious, almost divine ratios of music gave the art of music a sacred stamp, and musicians, therefore, had a high, almost priestly calling. The most perfect ratio of all was the 1-to-1 unity, or unison and symmetry, and that explains why symmetry was so popular. Look at the facades of any ancient building or modern imitations of buildings of such like, and the symmetry is striking. Artists, musicians, and poets aimed to achieve this same perfect 1-to-1 unity in their own works, in their creations, in imitation of God's creative example. Here's Werkmeister again. For now we see, hear, and perceive everywhere that God created nature through his omniscient counsel and wisdom, so that everything might strive to achieve the unity that is 1-to-1. It's important to understand that symmetry was not just an abstract or a neutral form. It held theological meaning. And this generated, spawned, and encouraged the development of many different symmetrical techniques. So now to poetry. Book 2 of Puttenham's classical text in 1589 is called Proportion Poetical. It shows symmetry in numerous techniques, including in meter and rhyme, and that was called proportion by situation and also proportion by figure. In Bach's time, 150 years later, symmetrical poetic techniques included the paragrams, poems that used a number alphabet to make identical totals, i.e. 1-to-1, from two parallel sentences. This is a literal and obvious numerical one-to-one equality that no one could miss. The acrostics that created two meanings, the meaning of the words and the extra meaning of the capitalized first letters, also a parallel technique. There were the Bildergedichte, the picture poems, which is Puttenham's proportion by figure. These used the lines of the poem to form a symmetrical shape, reinforcing the poem's meaning. For example, poems in the shape of a heart, as you can see here, or a star, or even a house. And one finds numerous combinations of each of these symmetrical poetical techniques. Most frequently in Bach's cantata texts, the line and the meter create a one-to-one symmetry. For example, the first and last lines of each stanza can be identical, as seen in this anonymous text from 1707. The first line, durch mächtige Kraft, and the last line, durch mächtige Kraft. And the rhyme scheme A, B, B, C, C, A, as in Puttenham's proportion by situation. That's an explanation of the symmetry of the rhyme scheme there. And in this example, by Bach's Mulhausen friend Eilmar in 1710, the first line, Mein Gott, ich folge dir, and the last line, Mein Gott, ich folge dir. The next verse is the same, Mein Gott, du leitest mich. Mein Gott, du leitest mich. And one from Erdmann Neumeister in 1713. It too starts and ends with the same line. Here, Mein Seelenschatz ist Gottes Wort. And its rhyme scheme is proportioned A, B, B, C, C, A, as in Puttenham's proportion by situation. And the syllables of each line also have a proportioned meter, 884, 8888. Now, every composer of the time would have understood the theological significance of the poem and the verses' one-to-one unity. When Bach set this verse to music, he created his own symmetry. He first composed a beautiful 8-bar instrumental intro. He then set the line, Mein Seelenschatz ist Gottes Wort. And then the first 5 lines he set twice. And then he set the last 3 lines 3 times. He ended the movement with the identical 8-bar introduction, now as an 8-bar outro. Bach not only recognized the symmetry of Neumeister's verse, his symmetrical choices show that he developed a new symmetrical form in line in his musical setting, in addition to the symmetry of the poem. So, what does this mean? One can see all kinds of patterns and suggest different interpretations. You could say that Bach chose these repetitions 1, 2, and 3 to represent the threefold nature of God: God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. You can also say that these 6 repetitions divide centrally at 3-3 to make a one-to-one unity. The clearest symmetry, though, is the proportion by situation, the identical opening and closing orchestral frame. It's easy to hear and obvious to see. It was deliberate and it was meaningful. Neumeister and Bach strove to achieve one-to-one unity in their compositions because of their Lutheran understanding of creation. This Lutheran way of thinking helps us today to grasp how Bach and his contemporaries understood music and its numerical essence, its innumerable number that produces innumerable numerals. And this in turn gives us greater understanding of Bach cantata texts, the poetic techniques used, and their meanings. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth, for another wonderful and fascinating presentation. So, Michael, I think there's a lot to talk about here, so we'll turn it over to you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Larry, and I don't want to talk too much because we need to have also a wider discussion about this. But first of all, thank you to you both. I'm fascinated about all these ideas and observations. And first, talking about Michael, what you said, I'm sure you all agree that we are fascinated by the oeuvre of Bach's cantatas, especially because we are knowing these pieces, and many of them are really masterworks, were produced more or less on a weekly basis as occasional music. And the deeper you get into this music, you realize how intricate it is, and what you presented showing that Bach in a way worked against Ziegler's rhythm, when he came up with a musical setting of this triple meter text turning into a double meter. That is quite impressive, and knowing at the same time that here Bach used the parody practice, where we tend to say, okay, he used it when sometimes he was too busy with other things and maybe wanted to make things easier for him. I mean, in that case, he didn't make it easier for him. It was quite the opposite. What do you think, Michael? I mean, why did he decide in that case, I have this old hand cantata, and let's take the bass line, and now inventing a new melody, which changed everything, that made the job for him not easier. Is it a kind of musical joke he made for himself and for the people very close to him?
Well, I wouldn't call it a joke exactly, for sure, but it's not your typical parody procedure, because the only thing that's really taken over is that 8-bar bass line. And it would have been, I probably should have said this in the talk, it would have been quite easy to keep the Ziegler's poetry in duple, simply going da 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 da, with an eighth note at 2/16, which would get very tiresome very quickly. But technically that's possible, and I'm sure he could find a way to make that interesting too. But what's super interesting about the actual melody that is superimposed on this, even before you get to the whole dance business, is that it has the strong syllables don't even line up. Even in the new meter, you jump up to weak syllables and so on. It's just very strange. So he seems deliberately trying to put it at odds with to make something special out of the soprano line. And then this, I think the idea behind it is it's a sort of surplus. There's a technical term I think in philosophy, hermeneutic surplus. And it would have been fine just to set it as a joyous aria, as a bourrée maybe, or a gavotte. But why not do two? It's just way more than is called for. It's way beyond the call of duty. And it's interesting that some of it is extremely readily perceptible, even when you're not paying attention. You're immediately moved by it. And the other one is you have to really pay attention to notice it. So it's not just that there are melodic levels and poetic levels, but there are also levels of perception. So it's a very sophisticated aria, I think, but it sounds very carefree and simple and so on. And again, it's in that context of the whole. Usually, the Bach cantatas, like the one that was being discussed the other day, Mein Herz schwimmt in Blut, it starts out very negative and then gradually morphs into being very positive with a dance movement at the end. But this one is different. It starts very grim, and then it has this over-the-top dance movement, and then it gradually works its way back to the negativity again and ends on a fairly negative note. Very strange cantata,
It is, and I wonder if this aria really fits to the paragraph number 7 in his working contract, where it is said, Bach, you have to make sure that your music is not too long. I mean, it's short, but the other thing is not too operatic.
Well,
and I mean, this is really dance music, And knowing about the history of the music and that Bach himself put himself into a very tight corset because he used the old basso continuo of the aria. It's for me unbelievable how a human soul is able to produce such masterwork within a few days or even in an afternoon or so.
Well, I don't know what it would mean to be. I mean, I can imagine things that he could have been run into the problem of being too operatic.
Yeah.
But the idea, I think that usually people understand that thing is that it shouldn't be operatic at all. And clearly, every single cantata practically is very operatic.
But especially in this piece, it's really hard to avoid the dance rhythm. I mean, if he had composed a gavotte performed rather slowly, it would also work as a kind of devotional music. But now, I mean, it makes the people at least dancing with their feet in the church. So
yeah, but again, the whole point is that there's no reason why dances and operatic arias can't be devotional. That's the whole point, right?
Yeah, that's what you are saying, but there were clerics during Bach's time arguing the church should not be turned into a dance hall. Nicht in einen Tanzboden verwandeln. So that was said very, very often by those people who didn't like the operatic music in the church. Okay, Ruth, thank you very much also for your presentation. It's always impressive or surprising what observations you are making concerning symmetry and now based on what you said in the beginning, Lutheran understanding of creation. I have one question, and I would be interested if you double-check this. I mean, these concepts of arias, repeating the first line in the end is something which turns up, as far as I know, sometimes in the second half of 17th century, probably not in church music. I know it from the earliest librettos of Hamburg opera, and it seems to be a very convenient form also to invent da capo arias, because then it's already in the text, and then my question is, because in the end you emphasize very much that this form is also based on Luther's understanding of creation. Did you Lutheran, yeah, but
not Luther himself.
Yeah, Lutheran.
By the time it got to Bach.
But what about all these? Or is this something which doesn't turn up in Italian lyric of that time, or in Catholic lyric in general?
Yeah.
I'm a little skeptical.
Yeah, I think that using the term Lutheran understanding of creation is because we're talking about Bach.
Yeah.
But what I said was that this is a generative technique. Yeah. And what I'm saying, it's come from Pythagoras. I mean, it's been for 2 millennia in this thought world. So what I'm trying to do is actually shine the light on how Bach and his how they would have understood it. Yeah. Yes, of course, it turns up in Italian opera, but I'm not talking. I'm trying to focus. Shed the light, the spotlight on Bach's sources, and Bach himself, and Bach's congregation, and Bach's poets, and what Bach himself had to deal with, and what it would have meant to him. So yes, it's a rough, and it's not accurate to say Lutheran view of creation as a universal term, because I've said it's called universal harmony, and it's been in Western civilization for 2 millennia. So it's not the sole property of the Lutheran.
Okay.
So do you understand? It's one manifestation. So for the convenience of this, I called it that. Because my sources that I've given are Werkmeister, who was very definitely Lutheran.
Definitely.
Yeah, so that's what it is. But the da capo aria, I mean, I did say it's a generative form. So even if the da capo aria only came in when you're saying, it could be a new form of exactly the same belief. Do you understand? They weren't going to always have the same manifestation. Of course they were developing ideas. But what's interesting to me is that this unity, this one-to-one manifesting itself in symmetry, continued right up to this time and enters the structures, and then it becomes a very creative limitation, or you said corset, but I mean, a very limitation, a very creative way of expressing something theological. And it was worth doing, not just because they needed a structure, but because it actually meant something. So it helps us when we're reading it, when we're listening, when we hear the da capo aria. We can say, yeah, okay, we've heard that before. Not yawn, 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 we just have to decorate this to make it different, which is the standard musical thing. Here it comes again, how do we... But it was symmetrical. It was, it meant something more profound. And we've had a lot of misleading narratives about these things. And I think nowadays we've got the freedom to change it now with this new understanding of the philosophy. This understanding of universal harmony did not die out in 1699, as we heard Tom saying earlier. It even goes right up to the end of the 18th century, but it goes beyond. Something slipped through the net. It didn't stop with the Enlightenment.
Okay, thank you very much. And sooner or later, I would like to see your description of how Bach, in a way, destroyed the concept of the poet. Something you described with the Ziegler text. The famous Trauerode by Gottsched. Here we have the case that Gottsched presented an ode, consisting of 8 stanzas or so.
Yeah, more even.
And Bach completely destroyed his concept. Changed the text into arias and recitatives. Almost all of them da capo arias. Maybe this also has something to do with the older concept and the more modern concept of, Gottsched is representing the age of enlightenment. I don't know. I would like to see your opinion about this.
Oh, I take the challenge.
And obviously, Bach had a lot of fun sometimes to make certain important changes in terms of rhythm and form in the text. And the good thing for him was, he worked on the piece after the poet finished his work.
One extremely important point about the Trauerode, though, is that it doesn't talk about her looking down on the earth from heaven and considering it to be a Dreckbild. Unfortunately, that was just the way that's provided in the Neue Bachausgabe. It very clearly says it's Denkbild, which is a totally different concept. But some people would have said that's an instance of Bach actually changing the poem. He did not do so.
Thank you very much again. And
let's open it up to questions from those of you here in the room.
Well, thank you, all three of you, for a really interesting discussion. I had a question for Michael, if that's okay. I loved your reading of that aria with the two dancers so that are cross purposes. And I have a comment and a question. The comment is, it really is such a brilliant example of what I'm starting to think we need to call some kind of theology of excess or something that seems to run through that. I think Stephen has done this as well. And I think it's a brilliant way of describing that what you said, why do it once if you can do it twice? Why have one dance if you have to? Why write a 1 hour passion if you can write a 3 hour? There's something fundamental about this Bachian aesthetic that just always just tops it off with one more thing. But what I wanted to ask you about was your reading of those two recordings you played. Because, well, there are people in the room here who have views about that, I know that, but what drove your very clear aesthetic preference for one or the other? I wonder if you could clarify.
Well, it wasn't simply aesthetic. I actually found the second one aesthetically interesting too, but I thought it was a distortion of what the piece is about. And that's an interesting problem in general in performance. A lot of performances are extremely interesting and rich and powerful and so on, but they don't project plausibly what the piece is about. What I always said to my students was, look, with artworks, there's multiple plausible meanings of an artwork, but there's an infinite number of implausible ones. And I found this sort of bordello approach of scooping up at the beginning of each line and being sort of knowing and so on, and clipping off the syllables and it's entertaining, but that's, I don't know, it's sort of this Euro-hip kind of almost refusal to take the cantata seriously. At least that's the way I hear it. I don't know if that's everyone else's perception. So that's where I was coming from. Now that may be subjective, I don't know, maybe others don't, just thought it was a nice way of singing it, and that scooping up and clipping off syllables is not the problem.
The only thing I was thinking about it is that, you know, I'm sorry about my shtick with, you know, the bodies and everything, but if we are talking about the fact that there are two dances going on here simultaneously, is there a way in which a performance might actually communicate that, convey that?
Oh, sure.
Not necessarily in that way, but I certainly didn't find that the Vienna, was it the
Right.
Vienna choir
Right.
performance gave us that through bodily engagement, through a kind of vocal display that brought that out.
Well, you have the special problem in this aria that both dance, it's one thing if you're dancing some, you know, brothel dance or something, but these are elegant court dances, and somehow maybe it would be interesting to have that be the counterpoint between, you know, sort of high and low culture or something, but I can't make that coherent as a response to the opening chorus and fit it in with the rest, because it's not just an aria by itself, it's part of a larger story, and I just couldn't see how it made sense in the larger story of the cantata. So
I think we have time for probably 2 more questions.
Thank you for a fascinating session. A question for Ruth, please. In the example you gave, you had an 8-bar introduction, followed by one statement, if I read it rightly, of the poem, and then 2 statements of the next group of things, and then 3, and then a return to the 8.
Correct.
Now there's an interesting point here about perception of the listener, as it seems to me, because if the 8 is perceived as an introduction, then that is, as it were, a background that informs what you subsequently hear in terms of relationship to what you have heard. So the question I have is, in that particular case, what roughly is the temporal relationship between the 1 and the 8-bar introduction? How long does it last?
The answer is I don't know.
Right.
So I'm quite well known for bar counting and things like this. My focus here was entirely the structure of the poetic text.
Right.
So I can't tell you what the relationship is. I must have done a quick count when I prepared this, and there was nothing obvious. So it wasn't that there was 4 bars for the 1, and 8 bars for the 2, and 12 bars for the. It was not relationship like that, because the text, when it's 2 and 3, are very much overlapping. It's repetitions of text. So it points out the fact that there are so many different ways of forming these proportions and forming these unities. There's not just one formula.
Right.
But as I said, the one thing that you notice is this complete melodic introduction. It's very melodic, it's very definitely complete, full closed cadence at the end, and then you start. And you get exactly the same at the end. It doesn't even, modulate to the dominant or anything. It's a complete phrase in itself, and you get exactly the same at the end. So you do get this sense of completion. What he did is unlikely to be perceived as 1, 2, and 3. That is more book work. That's book work. Yeah, that's book work. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. I can't help but pick up from Bettina's point. I was trying to restrain myself, but it just raises some really, really interesting issues, Michael. And I guess what I would like to think about is a sort of thought experiment. I mean, on the one hand, I absolutely understand your reaction to those 2 different versions, and I'm not sure that I like the second one either. And I'm not even going to talk about the boy versus the soprano thing, because I got 8 minutes tomorrow, and we'll hear about that then. And sorry for those of you online who won't get to hear that. But the thought experiment I'd like to think about is what we think about in vocal technique as good and pure and high and low, and respectful, and what we hear as that's a little low, there's a little bit of a scoop, the vowel isn't doing this, it isn't pure. And wondering how much of that is mapping onto these performances that we hear, our views of what would be pure and respectful in a way, from an 18th century perspective. Because here's a historical challenge, right? We can say what we think works today in reading this text. But if we're saying we want to read this the way Bach is and we want to think about that, but our choice in vocal technique is actually one that highlights our aesthetic preferences, what do we do with that? And what if it wasn't that at all? And how do we account for that? So, and let me just say, I agree with Bettina. I love thinking about the double dances and what that does, and I think it's really a wonderful reading. But you put those performances out there, so with the word bordello, so I just help anymore. So I will stop there.
Yeah, so I don't quite know what to say to that. I mean, yeah, I don't know, maybe Michael can help me. I just have a hard. One doesn't have to do what one did in Bach's day. I'm not, as I was saying before, there are multiple plausible things. The question is whether what you're doing actually fits with the general program was going. And that could be debated too, of course. But once you do that, I think it becomes more readily problematic than it does as an isolated thing. And I don't know. But as far as the Bach thing goes, can you imagine an 18-year-old boy or whatever? I can imagine them doing it in the coffee house when they're, let's say, singing the Lycian arias from the coffee cantata in drag and so on, which apparently might have been done. That's interesting, but I don't know. I don't see it in the Nicholas Church or the Thomas Church. I don't know. But you're right, though. Who knows?
Okay.
But one thing is for sure, they all were extremely familiar with all these dance forms.
Oh, yeah,
That's what we know. I mean, all these university students had regular dance lessons.
Yeah.
So we have this Leipzig calendar with addresses of all the dance masters, and that is 2 or 3 pages full of addresses. So I guess they all realize what is in the music, and it's the question what the cantor allowed in terms of expression and intense dancing, musical dancing, or voice dancing, better say voice dancing. And for me, this game with playing at the same time with 2 dance forms, I wonder if really the audience realized how clever Bach it did. Yeah. Nobody of them knew about the background of the piece. No. So, but my impression when seeing such amazing examples is that Bach himself really took care that to make it not too boring for him in his composing study.
Sure.
He liked to do such experiments.
Sure, but as said too, I think you can readily perceive the one dance, and the other one, the second one's much more difficult to perceive. So there's something for everybody.
It's also the much better piece. Actually, in the hand cantata, I don't like very much this movement. It's very.
Right. Well, it's hard to write a convincing aria about how well praised the fields are.
Well, I think on that note, we will have to wrap up this conversation, but it's a good place to end because in the spirit of, I think, Bach dialogue discussions, we should leave with as many questions as tidy bows around the conversation. So thank you to our panelists. And thank you to all of you in the room and for your questions. And if you're watching online, thank you for participating. And please come back for edition 6 when it is released.